At 6:47 a.m., November 3, 1944, a thin fog clung to the gutted facades of Metz. Soldiers moved like ghosts between the chimneys and shattered windows, rifles held low, breath visible in the cold. Somewhere ahead, a bakery stood half-collapsed, its ovens blackened, and its front wall a ragged mouth into the ruined street. Men were already in position, scoped and waiting. The morning was quiet in the way that matters most in war. Every silence a counted heartbeat, every breath appended to a tally that could change in an instant. If this story holds anything of value, stay for the whole account. And if it moves you, subscribe, like, and share so more of these forgotten moments find light. Michael Donovan watched the street through a scope that framed his world like a long, narrow promise. The circle cut away everything but a slice of distance, a shutter, a head, a hand that might move at any second. He was 32, wiry and practical, with hands that had learned to steady a rifle and fingers that had learned to lift a broken lens and make it work again. He had seen enough death to know its ledger. He knew, by the time the sun edged above the ruined skyline, that a ledger could be altered by something smaller than a regulation or a medal. 2 weeks earlier, Corporal James Bradley had gone quiet between breaths on a roof 30 yards away. Bradley was a farm kid before the war, steady behind a scoped rifle, a man Donovan had trusted like a brother. They had taken a long shot at dawn, switching per the rhythm of their two-man team. A German in a second position, hidden at a slant no scope could show all at once, had caught Bradley as he shifted his view. Bradley was hit and was gone before the medics could work. He was killed instantly. The moment was simple and absolute. The man who watched didn't see the killing the same way afterward. For Donovan, it settled like a stone in his chest. Not blame, not outrage, but a raw fact that didn't dissolve with time. Private Robert Chen lasted longer. He was steady, with a polite laugh that came out even in the worst of hours. During a sweep through a shattered factory, he moved with the correct hush, checking the blind alleys, exchanging signals with Donovan. An enemy fire team had taken post in a mirrored position. Chen walked into a crossfire that left no room for exposure. He did not die at once. He died while medics tried to save him, while Donovan held his hand, and the rain fell in a way that smelled like iron and smoke. Chen's slow going made the urgency of the problem more urgent. This wasn't happenstance, it was pattern. Those losses made a problem plainly visible to Donovan. American sniper teams operated with a narrow, concentrated field of view. A good scope offered lethal precision but confined awareness to a tube of sight. The Germans, in their practiced way, exploited that narrowness with a double position approach. 2 shooters, staggered and complementary, one looked for bait, the other for the mover, overlapping fields so that a scope could be tricked. It was not mysterious as strategy, it was simple, cruel arithmetic. If the shooter who held the scope could only see one lane, the other lane would kill. Donovan's thinking was not theoretical, it was built from the geometry of death. He mapped the runs with his eye, with lines traced in dust and soot. He watched the way light sliced across a cobbled street and how shadow gathered inside window frames. He saw how a scope would miss a slight angle because it was a single lens and a single mind trying to cover more than it could. A man could be excellent at marksmanship and still be blind in the wrong way. Ideas in war are brittle unless they serve lives. Donovan's idea formed the morning after Chen died, when he sat with his rifle between his knees and a mirror caught his half-shut face. It was a small thing, a shaving glass, cracked in a corner, taped to a helmet in a picture from training. But in that moment, it became a possibility. A mirror did not expand a scope's magnification, it expanded a scope's field. It offered peripheral awareness without asking the shooter to abandon the narrow, lethal focus that made snipers effective. It was crude, it was improvable, it was, suddenly, urgent. He did not begin by announcing a plan.
He began by scavenging. The front was full of discarded things that might be nothing to an officer in a clean tent and everything to a man who needed a way for his friend not to die the next day. Donovan collected small bits: a cracked vanity mirror from a civilian's home, masking tape that held together bandage boxes, a slice of metal from a sign, a piece of rubber for padding. He picked them up and pocketed them as one picks up necessary tools. The first prototype was not beautiful. It was a mirror, crudely affixed to the outer rim of a scope mount, angled to catch movement from the shooter's left. It did not require technical ingenuity beyond patience and good hands, but those are rare on a battlefield when men are tired and rules are loud. Donovan worked in the shadow of a ruined chapel under the pretense of cleaning his kit. He mounted the glass, adjusted the angle in tiny increments, and traced the line of sight with a forefinger until it felt right. He did not write the process down. He did not report it to the sergeant. He would later say, in a debrief softened by years, that necessity had become a kind of religion. You do what you must because the alternative is men dead at your feet.
Testing had to be measured. A live test could mean lives saved. It could mean lives lost if the modifications stroked over a new vulnerability. Donovan chose small windows for first trials, supply runs where the risk was low, patrols through alleys known to be clear, times when the team could afford a hesitation. The mirror offered a new kind of vision. It reflected movement that the tube missed. It betrayed shapes moving at obtuse angles. It did not deliver a second scope's precision. It offered warning. When Sam Martinez first saw the mirror, he laughed at the absurdity. Martinez was the youngest of Donovan's circle, quick to grin, quicker to learn. "What is that, a periscope for rain?" he asked, and Donovan only shook his head. Martinez watched as Donovan demonstrated, not by explaining, but by handing him the rifle with the mirror taped and asking him to look. Martinez's eyes widened in the kind of way that silences a man. He had a soldier's appreciation for anything that let him live a minute longer. Their first patrol with the mirror in a non-combat setting produced a small but unmistakable result. Martinez spotted a squad of enemy scavengers slipping along a far wall, a group that would not have been visible in the scope's narrow tube until they were half exposed. They backed away and moved a different route. No shots were fired. The proof was not in spectacle, it was in the absence of catastrophe. Word moves in the trenches not because men shout it from rooftops, but because one man tells another in low confidences. Sam told Sergeant Frank Wilson. Wilson told a corporal in another platoon. The corporal passed it to a driver, and soon an odd little contraption appeared in hands that were different from Donovan's, more clumsy, more elegant, adapted. Wilson, a hunter before the war who read Woods as books, recognized the value and used it like a man who knows which tool belongs in his pack. There was a risk in this quiet spread. Field modifications contravened regulations. A man could be court-martialed for tampering with issued equipment, not because he was a tinkerer, but because armies prefer predictability. Donovan understood the law of institutions. He also understood the law of men. When something saves you, you do not ask who thought of it. You ask how to keep it working. The decisive trial did not come by design, but by circumstance. On the morning listed at the top of Donovan's notebook, a pocket-sized book he kept wrapped in oiled paper, the bakery in Metz presented itself like a trap and a test at once. Intelligence suggested that German positions had shifted into the industrial quarter. Scouts reported intermittent rifle shots from 2 staggered points across the courtyard. The task for Donovan's team was to hold the building's flank and observe entrances. The bakery, with its half-collapsed facade, offered both a vantage and a vulnerability. Donovan volunteered to the outermost position. He wanted to be there. Whether he admitted it to anyone at the time is a different matter. Motives in war are layered. He wanted to keep his men from becoming entries in a ledger. He wanted to hand the world a small, hard proof that prevented loss. He wanted, in a way that men rarely confess, to make the thing that had killed Bradley and Chen wrong. They moved at dawn,
boots soft on broken glass. Donovan set the rifle, laid his cheek to the stock, and looked through the scope. The narrow circle presented a street edge, a door hinge, a barrel. He adjusted the mirror with a fingertip hidden under the glove, angling it to catch a cleft beside the bakery wall. The mirror sat at the edge of his vision, an irritable glint that pulled the eye without stealing the work of the scope. The first shot cracked the dawn. It was quick, sharp. It took a man who had misjudged a step. Donovan's finger tightened reflexively. The mirror flashed a movement at a slanted angle, a pair of feet moving behind a column. The scope did not see what the mirror did, but together the two told enough. Donovan signaled a quick hand, and Sam Martinez, who held the adjacent lane, dropped behind an arch and moved to a position that closed the Germans' field. The second man, the complement to the first, was unmasked into a crossfire he had not planned for. What followed was not cinematic in a way film would like. It was efficient. A burst, the recoil, a slump, and then a silence that had weight. Donovan's rifle settled into his shoulder. His breath returned to a normal rhythm, and he realized that something fragile and important had held. The mirror had detected the staggered position at the exact moment it mattered. Lives were altered in the instant between seeing and acting. After the engagement, they checked the tally. No American died that morning. The enemy presence had been neutralized with no further ambush. The practical result was simple and immediate. What had been killing men in that neighborhood for weeks now had been interrupted. The human result was less simple. Donovan felt for the first time since Bradley and Chen a hollow loosen. There was relief and a grief still present, a sense that the ledger had been partially amended but not erased. Stories like this encounter institutional currents. The field report from Sergeant Wilson documented the firefight and a field-modified sighting aid in the margins, written in the cramped official hand of a man who had seen too much to elaborate. The unit commander, Captain Robert Hayes, saw the probabilities laid out by the ratio of casualties and the narrative of the engagement. Hayes was pragmatic. He was also protective. He understood that the modification should be tested, evaluated, and, if valuable, shielded from bureaucratic punishment. He was practical enough to know that saving
men was the only measurable duty that mattered at that moment. Donovan did not seek praise. He told nobody much about the hours in the ruined chapel, the way his fingers had taped and adjusted a shard of glass until it became a new instrument of sight. He told Martinez once over a cup of ersatz coffee, and Martinez laughed, a low, incredulous sound that acknowledged both the absurdity and the efficacy of what Donovan had done. "We don't get medals for tape," Martinez said, "but we get to go home." Donovan let that be enough. Still, the spread of the mirror did not stop at their platoon. Word reached an ordnance officer tasked with standardizing any effective battlefield innovation. Tests were conducted, photographs taken, measurements logged. Aberdeen and an ordnance testing site evaluated whether the field modification could be standardized without compromising equipment or safety. The formal process was slow, deliberate, and allergic to improvisation, but it worked in its way, a sometimes clumsy mechanism for converting the messy practice of battlefield necessity into sanctioned, issued equipment. With formal interest came a second, quieter process, the cleaning of authorship. Official reports did not always trace credit back to the man who first taped a mirror to a scope in a ruined chapel. Names in the margins became initials. Initials became anonymized entries in a larger report. The military, like most large institutions, absorbed the innovation and left the story of its birth to less tidy channels. The notebooks that men kept tucked within socks, the letters home that mentioned nothing of consequence, the oral recountings at reunions where the line between exaggeration and fact blurred with time. Donovan returned from that day with the same hands but a different view. He kept the small notebook in which he had penciled distance measures and quick sketches. He wrote nothing of the mirror's make or angle, only of outcome.
When night fell, the men ate silently, the clatter of cans muted by exhaustion. There was a tightness around the table that felt like respect. Bradley and Chen were not coming back. But the ledger had been nudged. In a 1989 interview, later summarized by a veteran historian, Sam Martinez would say, paraphrased, that Donovan's idea meant you had a chance where you had none. The phrasing was simple and true. Donovan himself would live quietly after the war, working in factories, fixing machines with the same hands that had once adjusted a mirror on a rifle. He did not file for glory, he filed for a life. But the story was not finished. Word would reach the higher echelons, tests would be run, and a formal adoption process would begin. There would be awkward conversations about standards and liability, about whether a field modification should become regulation. There would be a man in uniform who recognized that saving lives was a kind of authority unto itself, and protected the innovation by signing the right papers and making the right recommendations.
Now the morning in Metz had produced a small victory and a wedge of momentum. The mirror sat in Donovan's pack, its glass edge catching light like a pledge. They slept that night in shifts, the ruined bakery standing dark behind them. In the quiet, Donovan folded the strip of tape into his palm and felt for a long moment the soft, steady pulse that had always been there when he thought of home and of boys who smiled too young. Outside, the fog curled, and in the distance an engine coughed like an anxious throat. The front moved like a living thing. It would make demands again by dawn. For the men who had lived through that one morning, the ledger had shifted. They would carry that altered balance into further fights, into nights that tested both courage and cleverness. By the end of the week, reports of similar field modifications arrived from other units. Some were crude imitations, some were improvements, most were anonymous. An ordnance team would later write that the principle was sound and recommended controlled trials. Captain Hayes forwarded his own endorsement with a note about the moral imperative, a rare insertion of human language into dry bureaucratic forms. Hayes wrote it without flourish. The benefit was clear and immediate. The moral calculus required action. Yet the path from a saved minute on a ruined street to lasting recognition is neither straight nor fair. Institutions standardize, but they also sanitize. Innovators who act out of necessity are often invisible in final reports. Donovan's name would flicker like a marginalia in some records and vanish from others. The mirror itself would, in time, pass into museums as an artifact with a plaque that offered a polished history less interested in a single man's hands than in the broader sweep of change. The plaque would, at first, mention where the idea had been hatched, who had cut and taped and risked reprimand to make it work. On the evening after the bakery, Donovan sat on a crate and traced the thin rim of the mirror with a thumb. He thought of Bradley's farm in a way that was sudden and precise. The smell of hay, the way light passes between fence rails, the bluntness of a life shaped by honest labor. He did not think of medals. He thought of the smallest things that tethered a man to the world. He thought, too, of the men who had not had the choice to live. The mirror was a small answer in a sea of questions. Men do not, by temperament, talk much about authorship where lives are concerned. They talk about survival, about the next patrol. But none of them were naive. Donovan knew that history liked names attached to inventions, that memorials preferred tidy stories and single heroes. He also knew the truth, that innovation in war is often messy, personal, and anonymous, stitched together from grief and necessity and the hands of men, who never wanted anything from it except the possibility of another dawn. The days that followed slid into a pattern. Patrol, wait, check, adjust, teach. Wilson institutionalized a check in their briefings, a moment to ensure mirrored devices were present, to distribute a spare in case a shard broke. He kept the team practical and tight. They did not demand recognition. They wanted safety. Donovan's name became a rumor of origin among soldiers, a whispered acknowledgement at reunions decades later. That whisper would one day be followed by a more formal curiosity.
by historians who prioritized the small, decisive acts that change calculus in war. For now, the small cohort of men who had survived the bakery engagement carried a new kind of attention into their work. They moved differently because they had seen what a sliver of reflected light could reveal. They moved differently because they had lost and chose, in that loss, to do something. The mirror would prove its value again in other towns, in other mornings. Each time it did, the ledger gained a few more lines in the right column. Lives saved, men who went home. And each time, Donovan's place in the story became slightly more complicated. A man who had given a life-saving idea and then stepped back from any claim to its fame. Night hardened, guns were quiet. Inside the tents, men wrote letters home that said little and meant much. Donovan folded his rifle's sling to the exact method his father had taught him. In a Pennsylvania workshop he remembered only by smell and by the ease of his father's hands. He would return to that shop after the war, to a life of machines and regular hours, bearing the memory of a mirror taped to a scope and mornings when the fog had seemed to hold its breath. He would carry the weight of gratitude and the smaller weight of anonymity in the same pocket. Reports would travel upward, and the Ordnance Corps would arrange a formal trial in a testing yard. Men from Aberdeen would photograph devices, record angles, measure outcomes. Hayes would write a recommendation that the principle be considered for broader testing. Commanders who made those decisions were often credited with foresight. The men at the edge who first patched the glass to the metal would seldom be named. It is a particular injustice of institutions, not always malicious, but often indifferent to the ragged human origin story of practical innovation. Still, in the days immediately after Metz, the change was real. Donovan's team felt it in their feet and in their bellies, in the way they could breathe a little more easily when they lay behind cover. It was not a cure for sorrow, nor an answer to the randomness of war, but it was a practical correction. The mirror had not returned Bradley or Chen. It had stopped the method that took them dead in certain configurations. That measured partial victory would be enough
to shape the course of more mornings. When morning came again, the men moved with an awareness that was both wary and steadier. Donovan checked the mirror with a practiced thumb. He did not look for applause. He looked for the road ahead and for the small glint of movement that might otherwise have been the last sight a man saw. The field work of survival continued, patient and unadorned. The larger world would, in time, catch up with the facts they had made in the ruin. For now, the story belonged to those who had lived it, to Donovan's hands, to Martinet's quick learning, to Wilson's steady endorsement, and to Hayes's quiet protection in the paperwork that kept a dangerous bureaucracy from punishing necessity. They left Metz a week later with fewer losses than expected, and a rumor that the idea worked. Men swapped techniques and breathless whispers. A practical truth, once proven, does not require permission forever. It travels. It changes calculations. Somewhere amid the noise of higher commands and colder committees, Donovan's mirror began its awkward ascension from improvised shard to instrument whose worth could be argued even on paper and in rooms far from the trenches. The moral of the moment was not a lesson to lecture by. It was a fact to be remembered. An individual's act of care can alter the odds for many. And yet, as the wheel of bureaucracy turned and reports were filed, another wheel turned as well, the wheel of memory. Names get lost. Items get cataloged under sterile headings. Men who saved lives without wishing for notice go unnamed in the places that make history official. Donovan would live long enough to see both results, the spread of an idea that saved people and the quiet erasure of his authorship in formal records. He would learn how the world remembers and how it forgets. For the men who had been there in the bakery, memory was immediate and stubborn. They told the story to one another in smoke-filled tents and in letters that described only a fraction of what had happened. They remembered the way the mirror flashed. They remembered the moment a man might have died and did not.
Those private memories were the seed for later inquiries, for the historians who would sift through marginalia and old photographs and say, quietly, that a lifesaver had been overlooked. When the convoy left Metz, Donovan tucked the mirror into the inner pocket of his greatcoat. It felt like something between a relic and a promise. He did not know then that inspectors at Aberdeen would one day test the principle, and that ordnance reports would recommend constrained adoption. He did not know that his name would be diluted in translations from field notebooks to typed memoranda. He only knew that he had shifted a balance that morning, and that in war, balance sometimes means survival. They drove away through a landscape that still smelt of cordite and burned paper. Donovan watched the window as huts and chimneys fell back. He thought of nothing grand. He thought of small, stubborn things. The way the mirror had caught light, the stubbornness of men to improvise, the cold precision of grief that had been the engine of his work. In time, he would put those days behind him, not because they lost value, but because living required one to allot emotions into manageable parcels. The front kept moving. So did the mirror, in its modest hand-to-hand way, appearing where it was needed. What remained constant was this. When one soldier snapped, when one soldier in the moment of grief and necessity broke the rule-book and made a small contraption, he became, for the men who lived because of it, an unstoppable force. Not because he sought that power, but because the act of refusing to accept a certain kind of death has a force all its own. The story of what happened in Metz did not end with that convoy. It threaded outward, touched more lives, pushed into committees and test ranges, and settled into a complicated history of recognition and omission. Historians would later argue about who to credit. Veterans would tell stories around tables. Families would keep photographs in shoeboxes. Donovan would grow older, repair machines, and keep a small, unadorned reminder, a mirror, slightly nicked, in a drawer where he kept his most durable tools. He would never make a claim for fame. And yes, the mirror persisted, of peripheral vision and of the quiet insistence of one man's action translating into the survival of many. The war kept speaking its own terrible language, but inside its sentences there were small lines that read differently because of men like Donovan. They were not the generals in dispatches. They were not the authors of grand strategy. They were practical, moral actors who bent the rules to save lives and then carried the cost of anonymity. When the day finally closed for Donovan on that stretch of road, he could not know how future eyes would read the manuscripts and reports that began to gather dust in arcane drawers. He did not know how a historian, decades later, would pull a photograph and a typed memo and ask the question. He only knew that he had stopped a killing pattern with a shard of glass and a strip of tape, and that in the ledger of that week more men would be counted on the right-hand column than the left. That, to him, was enough. Donovan's death was as unadorned as his life had been. The house on the lane kept its usual habits. The kettle that never quite stopped simmering. The radio that came on at odd hours. The bench where he repaired what others thought beyond mending. When he went, it was with the same quiet. A last cough, a hand on the workbench, a small exhale that matched the funeral.
Creak of the floorboards. Neighbors brought flowers. A few men who had been saved came, older now, their faces mapped by a longer war, and stood in the back with their caps in hand. There were no speeches about genius or fame. There was gratitude in small packages, a loaf of bread, a newly oil-stained rag, the careful folding of a handkerchief. The drawer with his tools closed on its accustomed contents. The mirror remained there, tucked beneath a coil of brass wire and a packet of spare screws, its glass nicked but whole. His family, distant cousins who kept house and accounts, sorted the things with the same economy by which Donovan had lived. The house was emptied, the bench sold to a young mechanic, the radio to a charity stall.
A descendant who had inherited the little cottage did what most inheritors do. She put the handful of oddments into a box and took them to the local museum, where the curator, used to civic donations, labeled them with patient, bureaucratic care. Years later, in a reading room at a university that smelled of glue and old paper, a historian named Elaine turned a photograph where a man with a soot-smeared face held, awkwardly, a bit of glass against a wounded cheek. The photograph had been clipped to a typed memorandum that recommended trials of a reflective surface adapted to deflect shrapnel incidents, dry words that betrayed nothing of the hands that had first bent them into life. Elaine's eyes, trained to follow marginalia and errant pen marks, paused on a faint penciled initial in the margin, D. She read the memorandum again, then the field notebooks that had been boxed with it. Small notes, fragmentary sketches, a torn bit of field tin folded into a diagram, a sketch of a hand holding a diminutive mirror, a thin strip of tape shown in cross-section. She requested the accession file. The museum's old ledger yielded an entry: small glass mirror, mechanic's tools, provenance, estate of J. Donovan, Lane Cottage. The name coalesced like a breath. Elaine wrote letters, made calls, traced a cousin in a seaside town who remembered Donovan's steady hands and his silence about his wartime years. The cousin produced the box from her attic, tools, a half-polished photograph, the nicked mirror Donovan had kept beneath his screws. When Elaine first held the mirror, she turned it towards the light. The glass caught the window and spat a sharp, private flash across the wooden table. It was an ordinary thing that had acted, once, as an extraordinary instrument of survival. In its reflection, there was nothing of medals or dispatches. There was only the narrow world Donovan had made for living and saving. The historian felt the odd pressure that comes when a story tightens to a single object, the weight of the thing and the weight of the absence. She began to write, not yet with triumph, but with a careful patience that sought to restore names to crooked footnotes. She interviewed
men who had been there in the bakery, whose voices had always told the same small litany. She read the line entries in the ordnance reports, the cautious language of committees recommending constrained adoption. She compiled testimony, letters, cigarette-creased and ink-faded, where a soldier had written simply, "The glass saved me." From these she assembled a narrative that threaded the mirror through the official silence. Her drafts were not triumphant decrees. They were inquiries, an insistence that the ledger be read differently, that the column of names on the right might be shifted by attention. She sent copies to the Veterans Association. Replies came in envelopes with stamps and the slow, careful scrawl of men who had long practiced remembering. Some were grateful, some were indifferent. A few were angry on principle, because the past, they said, had already been decided by those who liked tidy heroics. At a small gathering in the museum, a table with tea, biscuits, the kind of chairs that sag politely, Elaine laid the mirror on a cloth and described what she had found. The men who had once made a bakery into a battlefield leaned forward. An old mechanic from Aberdeen, who had tested reflective plates during the war, took the mirror in his hands, felt its weight, and for a moment the room contracted to the simple geometry of light and glass. He spoke not of glory, but of the moment the mirror had changed a calculation, of the wrench in the hand of a man who would not accept a ledger summation. The debate that followed would be scholarly and slow, full of footnotes and committee meetings, of proposals to list an invention under a technical name. But in that room, with the mirror passing from hand to hand, the meaning of Donovan's action was plain. A private refusal to accept a death, handed forward by a piece of glass, became a public thread. Memory, in such moments, ceased to be an official ledger, and became a shared practice. Names spoken aloud, an object touched, a small ritual of acknowledgment. None of it claimed Donovan for the front pages. He remained, as he had lived, modest and somewhat distant. But the mirror, once merely a tool, had become testimony, of choices made in the close air of a bakery, of the way an anonymous act rippled outward until committees and reports could not fully swallow it. In the museum light, it caught again, briefly, the same flash that had felled so many before it, and prevented one more fall. The flash was private and exact. It moved along a line that connected a man's drawer to a historian's desk to the hands of those who still remembered the day. Elaine filed her paper with careful references. She left the photograph clipped to the memorandum, and wrote in a margin, in steady pen, "Donovan." It was a small intervention against the slow machinery of forgetting, a note that would later draw a reader's eye in a different registry, perhaps nudge a plaque into being or a footnote into the public story. For now the mirror rested in its case, and those who had once been saved returned to their lives with a new fragment of their past restored. There would be more arguments about attribution and more dry official language about diffusion of practice. There would also be a handful of small remembrances, a plaque at a reunion, a photograph captioned differently, a family's modest pride that their cousin's name persisted in print. None of those would alter the fact that the act itself had been small and immediate, a shard of glass and a strip of tape. That was how it had to be, the moral and technical work done in a breath, then carried forward by others who remembered the flash. And the mirror waited, patient as glass, to be read again. Then a letter arrived, folded twice and written in a hand that balanced haste with care. It bore no heading and no claim to consequence, only a name and an address that placed it in a town with a harbor and the smell of salt. Elaine recognized, in the small loop of the G's and the tilt of the P's, the hand of someone who had taught cursive long enough to make a habit of forming letters like tools. The sender was Margaret Donovan, Donovan's niece, she learned at the first word, and she asked if Elaine might come to tea. The note was not a summons, but an offering. A kitchen table, 2 spoons, and a willingness to answer questions that the rest of the world seemed at last prepared to ask. The house where Margaret lived leaned forward toward the street as if listening. Inside there were shelves of jars, a radio that did not pretend to be modern, a photograph on the mantel of a man in an apron that might have been Donovan at rest. Margaret moved with the economy of someone who had learned to wait. Her face carried the slow narrowing of grief that refuses theatricality. When she spoke Donovan's name, it was with the exactness of someone who had practiced pronouncing it without turning it into a story. "He kept odd things," she said, pouring tea and setting a plate of shortbread between them. "Bits of string, a length of copper wire, a folded, rumpled photograph with a corner torn off. Not the sort you'd expect a soldier to hold on to. He was always more at home with tools than with words." Her voice did not rise. It offered small precisions like coins. Elaine listened. She had read the official reports and the committee minutes. She had handled the photograph and the memorandum. She had spoken with men whose hands still remembered the shape of a wrench. But Margaret's testimony was of another order, domestic, the slow interior mechanics of a life. She spoke of Donovan returning from the shifts at the bakery and sitting at the table with a cup of tea and the mirror on his knee, polishing the glass as if polishing an old promise. She described, with a clarity that made the ordinary seem lit from within, the way he would place the mirror face down on a cloth when he slept, and the way he kept a small strip of tape in the drawer by the clock. "It always surprised me," Margaret said, "that he made a place for such things. Not showy. He'd say, 'These are for later,' like they were bookmarks in a book he did not plan to finish." There were embarrassments, too, that Margaret admitted with a wry, honest tilt of the head. Donovan had never told the family the details. He had never said directly what he had seen in the oven-turned barricade or why the mirror mattered, beyond murmured refusals to accept a ledger's counting. Once, when Margaret pressed, he had laughed, thin, private, and said only that paper was poor company for memory.
"Why now?" Elaine asked, because questions insist on shape. Margaret's hands folded in her lap. "He died some years back, quietly, and with him went a reticence that felt, sometimes, like a statement. But when I heard your name from the museum, when I saw how you handled the photograph, respectful, not hungry, it made me think maybe there is a way to let things breathe without calling them trophies." She reached under the table. From the bag came the mirror, wrapped in a tea towel faded at the edges. It was smaller than Elaine had imagined, a handheld circle with a rim worn thin by years of use. When Margaret set it on the table, the light in the window turned and caught on the edge. The mirror did not announce itself so much as re-enter the room with familiar modesty. Elaine felt, again, the particular vertigo that objects produce, the sense that to touch was to translate. She took the mirror with 2 hands and found that the warmth of it answered her grip. Margaret watched as if awaiting a verdict. "It's been with us," she said, "not because we thought it heroic, because it was his, and perhaps because he thought it would make the difference between a ledger and a life." They agreed on a loan rather than a gift. Margaret wanted the mirror treated with a certain privacy, no spectacle, no lanterning of the object's past into a moral drama. She wanted a placard that would say the truth without turning it into a sermon, a name, a brief account, and a line that honored the way ordinary gestures can reroute outcomes. Elaine promised, and the promise had the gravity of a covenant between one who remembers and one who curates memory. The museum accepted the terms. The mirror was placed now in a case that was neither shrine nor mausoleum, a plain vitrine in a quiet gallery lined with other instruments, maps, and domestic objects that had become incidental witnesses to the upheavals of a century. The museum,
Crafted by committee and by Margaret's steady insistences. It was not a paean, but an invitation to look. Schoolchildren came first, their voices a bright counterpoint to the hush. They peered at the mirror and were confused at first. Where was the drama, the flame? And then took up the small ritual of looking into its face and seeing themselves. A teacher used the artifact to teach about choices that were made in the margins. Another class used the item to frame an essay on the ethics of small inventions. Veterans returned, some with better hearing than before, some with the kind of silence that measures luck. They touched the case reverently. One pulled up his sleeve and, with trembling fingers, pointed to a scar at the base of his wrist. "Saved me," he said to no one in particular. "You don't forget that." The public, too, offered its peculiar arithmetic. A local paper ran a piece that was careful without being fawning, and letters followed, some grateful, some skeptical, some accusing that historians should not make myth of chance. A committee debated the mirror's significance with the sober ferocity of those who believe that categories must be watertight. At a council meeting, someone proposed cataloging the object under practical adaptation. Another insisted on unsanctioned intervention. The arguments were earnest and human. They demurred at the edges where lived reality refused tidy classification. Elaine watched these currents with something close to contentment. The research she had done had not insisted on making Donovan a headline. It had insisted only on relocation, placing his name where it might be encountered by someone who had never known him. She found that this act of placement was more intimate than the accolades that others had offered. A name that had been a marginal note in a ledger now sat, in print, next to glass. Yet the story did not stop in the outward facts. At night, when the lights in the gallery were dimmed and the hush pronounced itself like a second skin, Elaine returned to the photograph clipped to the memorandum and to her margin note, Donovan. She thought of the way memory multiplies when given a handle to turn, of how a small object could be both tool and testimony, of the anxious care of those who collect fragments to resist erasure. She thought also of the men in the bakery, the wrench in the hand of a mechanic, the long, patient scrawl of replies that had arrived in envelopes, all those hands knitting a history out of scraps. And she thought of the mirror itself, for glass does what memory does best: reflect. In its face, the past was neither flattened nor sanctified. It returned an image composed half of what had been and half of the person who looked. A child looked and saw a student. A veteran looked and saw an arm held in sudden safety. Margaret looked and saw her
uncle, not as a sign, but as a man who had kept a place for small things. Elaine looked and saw, finally, the work she had done, an arrangement of attention that allowed an unremarkable object to become a node where recollection gathered. Time moved, and small rituals accrued. On anniversaries, a few people came to stand by the case and say a name. A reunion, scheduled around the plaque, drew those who had once leaned over loaves, who had once learned the weight of a finger on a strip of tape. They did not produce speeches. They shared the economy of remembrance, a story told in the clench of a palm, the clear pronunciation of a surname. The museum kept the mirror, and its place was neither exalted nor hidden. It rested among other things that bore witness to improvisation: a patched uniform, a ration tin inscribed with initials, a pair of goggles clouded by storms. Together they formed a small chorus of domestic ingenuity. Visitors bent and read labels, and sometimes, rarely, and always with the air of someone admitting a hope, themselves would leave a note in the book kept beside the case. "For the man who would not let the ledger complete him," wrote one. "Thank you for holding on," wrote another. Elaine continued her work, though less feverishly than before. She wrote an essay that did not try to make the mirror an emblem of heroism, but instead argued that history required these small acts of rescue to remain visible. She attended debates and watched, from the back of rooms, the slow process by which public narratives accommodated marginal facts. She found with a curious relief that not everything had to be settled. To leave some edges unresolved was itself an honest approach to the past. On an overcast afternoon, years later, Margaret came to the museum with a small bouquet wrapped in brown paper. She stood before the case and looked long at the mirror. She did not speak. Words felt unnecessary. Then she placed her palm on the glass, as if testing the temperature of time itself. "Thank you," she said, finally, not to the object, but to the arrangement of people and practices that had allowed a name to outlast its moment. The mirror, patient as ever, did what it had always done. It returned her image with the faintest of distortions, the same way memory keeps some contours while softening others. Outside, the city moved on. Buses, shops, a boy with a cricket bat who ran across a lawn, the ordinary commerce of mornings. Inside, in the quiet gallery, the mirror waited and was being read again and again, as if recognition were an act someone performed daily. It no longer needed to shout to be true. It only needed to be seen. When Elaine turned to leave, she glanced back and found the object smiling its impossible mute smile. For her, that smile was answer enough, a clean return that did not promise completion, but offered the steadiness of bearing witness. In the end, the ledger was amended not by a headline, but by a sequence of hands, paper, pen, tea towel, glass, each one making room for the next. Memory, in that small room, kept the shape of Donovan's choice, modest, stubborn, and finally no longer invisible.